Hello and welcome to the discussion Three Countries, One Aim, Rethinking European Energy Security, organized by Youth Atlantic Treaty Associations of Germany, Hungary, Spain. My name is Mariam Koblashvili. I am a board member of YATA Germany and Vice President for Public Diplomacy on the Executive Board of YATA International. Energy security is a key component of NATO's security architecture. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has brought the issue of energy supply to the forefront of the discussion. It became clear that each country's energy policy must be scrutinized by the security policy. Today, we want to analyze the status quo of energy policy of NATO, Spain, Germany, and Hungary, and find out how NATO and its member states should adapt their energy markets to the new geopolitical challenges. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers. Michael Rule, Head Climate and Energy Security Section, Emerging Security Challenges Division, at NATO. Mr. Rule, thank you for joining us today.
Good evening.
Good evening. Anna Valle. She is Energy Security Analyst and PhD at European Security and Defense College. Ms. Valle, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Mr. Tamas Csiky-Varga, expert, Transatlantic Security and Defense, University of Public Service of Hungary. I want to thank you too, Mr. Csiky-Varga.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Maria Pastukova, Senior Policy Advisor, Energy Diplomacy, S3G Berlin. Ms. Pastukova, thank you for your attendance.
Many thanks, Mariam. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, of course, I want to thank our participants for the attendance too. Dear participants, you can ask our speakers questions via Q&A function. And my colleague Patricia Moreno, President of YATA Spain, will support me today as co-moderator and make sure that your questions that can be submitted also during the discussion get through to us and are asked. So now I would say we start our event with the introductory input of Mike Rule. After that comes the Q&A session with our country experts, and the last half an hour is reserved for your questions. So, Mr. Rule, the floor is yours. Please share with us how the Europeans must rethink their energy security from NATO's perspective.
Thank you very much. Maybe the first thing to say is NATO is not an energy institution. Unlike the European Union, we do not have legislative powers. So we cannot tell our member states how to run their national energy policies. This is a national prerogative, or to some degree an EU prerogative. That said, energy and security are closely linked, and NATO is a security organization. Hence, we are appealing, if you will, to the collective common sense of allies. So we can't tell them what to do, but we can, by discussion, come to conclusions about what we, at least on paper, should be doing. And I think we all want the same. We want to have reliable, climate-friendly energy security, and we want it at an affordable price. That's what we all want. The question is, how do we get there? And in particular, how do we get there in a safe and coherent fashion? Again, we cannot tell allies what to do, but we can discuss possible solutions. And sometimes, hopefully, NATO can be part of the solution. So what does these basic facts that we need to discuss and are discussing, what do they entail? Let me make 10 very brief points, telegram style. The first, we all agree, and we've said this in many communiques, on the need for the diversification of energy supplies, because we need to minimize opportunities of coercion by a dominant supplier. We've said this in communiques, not all allies did it. They're now paying a very high price for that. But I think it's actually a fairly simple mechanism. If you have only one supplier, and if that supplier is not very nice, you have a problem. So we need to diversify our energy suppliers. The second basic fact, I think, is we all agree on the need for a flexible and redundant energy system. That's why we are now, in many countries, you see LNG terminals popping up. You see the EU in particular did this reverse flow of pipelines. Gas can now go both ways. So today, Ukraine, for example, gets a lot of gas from the West. In the past, it was only one directional from West to East. So to build redundancy into the system, flexibility into the system, is something that Europeans have been doing for quite a while. And it was the European Union, not NATO, that really pushed this forward. Then, of course, the need for infrastructure security, recently highlighted by the sabotage against the Nord Stream pipelines in September. Protecting your infrastructure is a national responsibility. So that's not per se NATO's job. But of course, NATO can help protect national infrastructure. Today, most infrastructure is international when you think of pipelines, which cross many borders. We can, for example, in the maritime area, we can use our navies to deter hostile acts or to inform infrastructure owners about impeding dangers. Then the fourth point is the need for resilient energy supplies in a crisis. We at NATO think, of course, in terms of crises, and it's important that a country in a crisis is capable of generating military force in the NATO framework, but it cannot do so if, for example, a cyber attack has paralyzed the energy system. So and no fuel station works anymore. So you need to look at energy resilience, and this is also something where NATO plays a role, because we produce so-called guidelines for energy resilience and other areas as well. And we make allies to do self-tests, stress tests, if you will, to check whether their energy system is resilient enough to allow for example, military mobilization in a crisis. Then, of course, the fifth point, the need for safe sea lines of communications, especially since LNG becomes a major issue. Sea lanes need to be safe and secure. NATO has done in the past a counter-piracy mission at the Horn of Africa, which also has helped, of course, the energy transfers through in the maritime domain. Our naval forces keep the sea lanes open, and this is something that an indirect contribution, I would say, of NATO to energy security of allies. Then also in our military, we need to make sure that our military receives fuel, and it needs a lot of fuel, receives fuel from non-Russian sources. As we are moving away from Russian sources, generally from Russian energy, we also must make sure that this is the case for the military. And we're looking right now into how to achieve that as well. We are looking at, in the same context, we're looking at the so-called fuel supply chain. How do we make sure that as we have more forces now in NATO's east than we had before Crimea in 2014, how do we make sure that these forces are supplied with sufficient fuel at all times? So we're looking at the so-called NATO fuel supply system to make sure that our forces get what they need. Then, looking a bit further afield, I think we all agree at NATO on the need to embrace the green transition away from fossil fuels in our civilian life, in our civilian economies, transportation system, but also in the military. We want to green our military, not because Greta Thunberg will love it, but because we think it makes sense to have a military that is more fuel efficient, needs less fuel, has therefore a smaller logistical burden to take. So we're looking at these technologies that promise us a force that in the end of the day will be greener, but also stronger. So that's a big struggle, but we've started this now. And over the next years, you will see that the emissions in NATO forces will go down. Again, we cannot tell our allies how, by far, and how much, and by when, but the process, I think, is clearly underway. Then as we green, in other words, as we use new technologies, and this is also a very big issue at NATO now, how do we make sure that we do not trade the gas dependency on Russia with a, say, lithium dependency on China. In other words, how do we make sure that the green transition works and we make it work without becoming too dependent, again, on another supplier who may not be the nicest of possible suppliers. So that is a big question mark that we also need to discuss, and we are discussing at NATO. My ninth point, we also need to see how NATO can support partner countries, especially energy producers or transit countries. And to give you an example of how that help can be rendered, we've done before the war, Russia's aggression on Ukraine, we've done in 17 and 21, 2 major tabletop exercises in Ukraine on the how to protect the electrical grid from cyber attacks and kinetic attacks. And actually, when the war broke out, these were exactly the targets that the Russians had been looking for. So in a way, we had been playing a scenario, helping the Ukrainians to understand what could possibly happen to them and how to better prepare themselves. And as you see, the Ukrainians are very good, actually, in preparing their energy system, which is a major target for Russia against this. We did a similar exercise in Georgia. So we're looking at how we can use our expertise to help non-member countries to enhance their energy resilience in difficult circumstances. And finally, the need to listen to partner countries, especially when they are transit countries or producers like Ukraine and Georgia. And again, I'll give you a concrete example. Next Tuesday, I'll be chairing a meeting of the political committee of NATO with the chief executive officer of Naftogaz, Ukraine. And this is not the first time we did this. They come regularly to brief us on the energy situation in Ukraine, what's the state of the transmission network and the like. And these briefings are, of course, of very high caliber, and they bring a lot of information for the allies. Another example, we are preparing a meeting, again, one of many meetings of the North Atlantic Council, the highest body in NATO, with top officials from the EU and from the International Energy Agency to discuss the implications of the green transition, because that is an issue that is important for EU, as I said before, for the EU, as well as for nations, as well as for individual allies. So in some, as I said before, we cannot tell allies how to run their national policies, but we can appeal to their collective common sense. And while this doesn't always work, sometimes they display not quite as much common sense as I would like to see, by and large it works. And by and large, I think allies, especially after the shock of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, allies follow very similar lines when it comes to looking again at what energy security really means for them and how it can be achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your input, Mr. Rulin. Thank you. So now I would say that I have a few questions for our speakers, but my first question goes to all of you, dear speakers. I would say, please tell us how the energy system works in your countries. I mean, in Hungary, in Spain, in Germany. And in your answers, please make it clear how your country's energy supply was before February 2022 and what happened or what has been changed afterwards. So, Ms. Pastukova, I would ask you to start.
Sure, happy to start. And just very first off, talking about how energy systems looks in the largest economy in the EU is probably a topic for a whole discussion. So we'll try to just highlight some very, very key numbers. So when we look at the German energy supply situation, this is just one part of the equation, right? The demand part of this is just as important. But looking at the energy supply, German energy system runs on 1/3 of it runs on oil. So 35% of its energy consumption is oil-based. Natural gas is about 25, or has been about 25%. The renewable share is growing in the electricity sector. It has been 17-point-something% last year. And then there is still a considerably large share of hard coal and lignite that come together to about 20% of a German energy mix. The share of nuclear energy that has been quite prevalent, as you probably know, until the nuclear phase-out discussion and the Fukushima disaster in 2011, it has shrunk considerably over the last years, even before the invasion, and is right now about 3.2%. So when we look at how the energy mix has changed over the period of since Russia's invasion into Ukraine, we see that there was not only a significant decrease in natural gas consumption, it was about 15% on average. So it's different across different sectors and by different stakeholders, but on average, it's about 15% of total gas demand, but also a decrease in nuclear energy consumption, which is actually quite weather-driven. You must have heard about the droughts and also lack of nuclear generation in France, and Germany still imports quite a lot of that. Then we have an increase in the use of other energy sources, particularly lignite and hard coal. This has been it has been a very difficult political decision for the current government that is very keen, or it's driving Germany's green agenda and energy transition, but has had to resort to upping the coal use as a short-term measure while renewables are being built out in order to wean its off the dependence on Russian fossil fuel imports. The share of renewables has actually also risen considerably, 5% within the last year. And these are basically the changes that were not led by some concrete policy decisions last year. The increase in renewables is something that would have happened anyway, because this is the result of the long planning pipeline that has been in place before the invasion. Maybe what's important to note on the German energy systems is, aside from how the different energy resources share has changed, is how the energy supply flows have changed. And maybe the most significant one is the change in the gas imports flows. As you know, Germany's dependence on Russian gas imports has been very high. It was 55% back in 2021, so 55% of Germany's gas imports came from Russia. Today, Germany doesn't import any gas from Russia directly. So we're talking Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. There is still some Russian gas coming via Ukrainian transit and Czech Republic, and apologies for that. But this is a very minuscule share. So Germany now mostly sources gas from Norway, from Netherlands, and LNG that comes into Europe via the Netherlands hub and Belgium. But this is all pipeline gas. Germany still doesn't import any LNG. I think they just started as the first LNG terminal has been launched last year in Wilhelmshaven. This is very, very small share. It is supposed to grow because Germany has now extensive plans for LNG import infrastructure. And finally, maybe the oil imports, which people don't talk much about. They, in fact, didn't change much last year, because until the European oil embargo has kicked in December 2022, Germany, as all other European countries, continued importing Russian oil as they have been doing that before the embargo. Right now, the share starts to sink because the embargo is now in place, mostly replaced by the US shale oil and oil from the Middle East. But we will still see how the situation develops. So the major change is actually phase out of Russian gas imports in Germany's energy mix. I will stop here, but looking forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pastukova. Now I would like to ask you, Mr. Csiky-Varga, to explain us how the situation looks like in Hungary.
Thank you very much. And of course, we need to keep in mind that Hungary has kept a rather outlier position also in energy policy compared to other allies. I also brought you a couple of data to underpin the change. And also have some explanatory notes. First of all, I start by saying that according to Eurostat data, the energy import dependence of Hungary in 2020 was relatively high, 87% on crude oil and oil products, 76% in natural gas, and 44% in fossil fuels. while the EU average was 57.5% in overall. So Hungary was significantly more dependent. If we point out Russian dependence, then Hungary was the third country in energy dependence on Russia, behind Lithuania and Slovakia. And 54.2% of oil, gas, and coal supply came from Russia. Now, it's important to point out the change, and we have some rather new data. Actually, some of the statistical office data was published only today, and we have data for the January-September period in 2022, so not for the whole year now. The energy import between the first 9 months of 2022 versus the period 1 year earlier has decreased rather significantly by 7.8% in volume. At the same time, it was 2.6 times more expensive. So that's 260% increase in prices. So on the one hand, less energy imports. On the other hand, for much expensive prices. And out of this, gas imports were 3.5 times more expensive, while electricity imports were 3.8 times more expensive. So it was very unfavorable for the country. To give you exact values, the value of energy imports in this January-September 2022 period was 11.7 billion euros. That's quite a sizable sum of money. And it was 7.7 billion euros more than a year before. So that was, again, a very unfavorable change, a huge increase. And this also brought about the unfavorable change in foreign trade balance, because in these first 9 months in 2022, Hungary encountered 5.8 billion euro losses in foreign trade balance, and it was the consequence of very expensive energy imports. To be more precise, because natural gas is always the most important because of the role of Russia, actually the national energy consumption, out of which 26.4% was relying on natural gas, also increased by about 5.5% compared to the previous year. And the most important conclusion in terms of costs is that the cost of energy imports, if we compare 2019, so 1 year prior to the war and actually prior to COVID, and 2022, then it rose, the cost of energy imports rose from 5% of GDP to 13%. So 30% of gross domestic product in case of Hungary is spent on energy imports. That was the situation last year. Within the energy mix, nuclear power is the most important, providing for 44.7%, and natural gas is the second important, providing for 26.4%. Now, the situation after February 2022 has not changed in terms of supply. As you might be aware of, Hungary did not cut relations, and Russia did not cut versus Hungary the relations in terms of providing natural gas. And it's important to point out that natural gas is the key component, because otherwise, regarding oil, for example, and oil products, Hungary is not dependent solely on Russia, and it's much easier to account for any alternatives. And it's important to see that by September 2021, that was just a couple of months prior to the war, there was a new 15-year long-term gas contract signed with Gazprom. And such a long-term gas contract was the foundation of the security of supply for Hungarian natural gas throughout the previous decade as well. And once the war started, the security of supply was prioritized over any other aspect in the wake of the war, because it was simply not clear whether there will be enough supply for all of Europe if Russia cut the gas. And actually, Gazprom kept the flow of gas intact for Hungary. Now, the second component that was key was affordability. And because of this long-term gas contract, during the summer 2022 gas price surge, this Hungarian-Russian long-term agreement offered more favorable prices than it was available on the market. So again, it was beneficial for until about autumn 2022. And one more thing that relates to the people's views, the population's perception. Since 2018, cutting utility prices, so low energy prices, was a prime domestic political message on behalf of the government. Therefore, people pretty much subscribed to the explanation that Hungary depends on Russian gas. It's important to keep this gas flowing, and it's important to get it as affordable as possible. Now we have seen, and that's why I told you so many data, that the import price of energy has already increased enormously and created very substantial loss in foreign trade balance. At the same time, the government was eager to sustain domestic political support, and still there was some modification to this low utility prices campaign, but actually it was kept alive, and it is something that the government does not want to let go. At the same time, to put it very briefly, a green transition with renewables was not really prioritized in the past decade. Actually, it was solar energy that started to grow, but only after 2015, 2016. And by the end of 2021, I only have data for the year prior to the war started, it provided almost for 10% of gross electricity production in Hungary. So it was a very substantial increase. At the same time, other forms of renewable energy production was not so much put to the forefront. And one last thing to mention is the Paks 2 power plant development, because it is again tied to Russia, to Russian investment, and Rosatom originally agreed in the first half of the 2010s, and then coming to kind of a halt because of the 2014 first aggression of Russia against Ukraine, and the economic, political, and technological debates within the European Union whether Russian technology, nuclear technology should be allowed, and Rosatom precisely should be allowed to build this power plant. This is something very important and determining for Hungarian energy production because the ratio of nuclear power generation is more than 45% in the Hungarian energy mix. So this is something that cannot be replaced. And the original Paks 1 power plant is aging out. So by the first half of the 2030s, we should have the Paks 2 blocks, the new 2 blocks in operation. Now the question mark is how is it going to happen and who is going to build it, if not the Russians. And well, of course, there are other options. So it's not only an economic, but also political decision. Maybe that's what I would like to share as an introduction, if that's suitable for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now, Ms. Valia, the floor is yours.
Well, regarding how energy system works in Spain, the Spanish energy system has had a particular profile, which is defined chiefly by 3 variables. Firstly, Spain is a country highly dependent on external resources. The Spanish gas and oil sectors are characterized by their almost complete dependence on other countries. Secondly, its supply is extremely diversified, not only with respect to energy sources, but also as to the origins of the resources we import. I mean, Spain has a diversified electricity generation mix that combines many technologies, renewables, such as wind, photovoltaic, solar, and besides we get oil and natural gas from many different countries and has an excellent regasification infrastructure. consisting of 7 plants. So we could say that our oil and natural gas dependence is thus offset by the use of local resources and diversified oil and natural gas import. Finally, it would be the third factor. Spain is an isolated import-dependent nation. Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, remains largely an energy island that can hardly participate in the European electricity market. This means a level of interconnection capacity of only 6%. Regarding natural gas, the French and Iberian markets are interconnected thanks to 2 gas pipelines. And currently a third interconnection is being pondered, and it will be palm hydrogen. And then how Spain's energy supply was before February 2022, and what has been changed? As we have seen, Spain is significantly dependent on oil and natural gas, but at the same time has a highly diversified supply. Traditionally, the most important areas to provide oil and gas have been North Africa, as well as Gulf of Guinea, the Middle East, and the Americas. In 2021, Spain imported oil from more than 15 countries. Regarding natural gas, Spain had more than 14 providers in 2021. Our first provider has always been Algeria, who sent natural gas through 2 pipelines, and well, this country provided half of the total natural gas Spain imported. The second provider of natural gas was United States. The third provider was Nigeria, and the fourth imported was Russia, followed by other many countries. And how did this natural gas enter into Spain? Well, half through pipelines, mainly the 2 that connected Spain with North Africa, and the other half in form of LNG. After February 2022 and until now, well, there have been changes. The main oil providers are more or less the same ones, and oil suppliers hold its diversity. Regarding natural gas, we can see some key differences. Firstly, where does natural gas come from? Now the 4 main providers stay: United States, Algeria, Nigeria, and Russia. But there is an important difference between the supply now and before 2022, and it is that the providers are the same, but not in the amount of natural gas they export. United States and Russia imports to Spain much more natural gas than they did before the Russian crisis. In turn, there is less diversity. Secondly, 33% of the total natural gas imported is transported through pipelines, and the remaining 67% enters as LNG. This is another difference from the situation before the Ukrainian crisis. The volume on LNG has risen significantly. And finally, we can observe another change regarding natural gas export. Spain is exporting much more natural gas. Natural gas exports increased by 104% compared to January 2022. And France is the main destination for exports, followed by Italy. So in conclusion, Spain's energy supply has changed since February 2022, above all in natural gas. we have less diversity and much more natural gas from Russia and United States. We import more LNG and less natural gas through pipelines. The Spanish natural gas export to the rest of Europe grew notably, and a new reassessment of a Spanish interconnection is taking place, provided her geostrategic importance as an energy hub for the rest of Europe, so that we can see a reconfiguration in many energy actors, how energy is imported, and a new assessment of how much important interconnections are.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vale. Thank you. And now I have the next question for you, Ms. Pastukova. And I would stress that for decades, for Germany, energy security was not really connected with security policy. For example, you mentioned also the Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 was not seen as a poor, or Nord Stream 2 was seen as a poorly economic project, and the security aspect was really ignored. I remember about quotes of representatives of German governments that this project is an energetic project. This project is poorly economic project. So I would ask you, was it a mistake of the German government? And how do you imagine Germany's energy policy in the future?
Many thanks, Miriam. Maybe just to start off with Nord Stream 2, we can't forget that this is a pipeline that never taken up operation. So this has never even become an economic project in that sense. So if we are talking about Germany intentionally or like purposely building out dependence on Russian gas imports, then it's much more important to start talking about Nord Stream 1 first, because that's actually the pipeline that Russia has used to, well, let's say it's plainly to blackmail Germany last summer by first subsequently cutting and then completely cutting gas supplies via this pipeline. Nord Stream 2 was there as a political leverage. You're right. Germany has been, to some extent, even building its economic prowess based on the stable supplies to relatively cheap gas from Russia for decades. This has started actually back in the 70s with the build out of Ukrainian gas transit between the Soviet Union and the European countries and Germany. There was this deal, pipes for gas, where Germany would supply the technology or in the infrastructure and would get gas instead. And, you know, this has been indeed a short-sightedness on the side of the German government. There were several, and probably the one before the current one is the one that has taken most decisions on Nord Stream 1 and 2, which is partly, you know, I cannot justify any of that, but before 2009, before the first gas price and supply crisis related to Nord Stream 1 and the Ukrainian gas transit, Russia has delivered. It's delivered gas, it delivered it at approximately the same level, at rather cheap prices compared to the global market. The fact that back in 2009, when the first disruption started via Ukraine, have not been taken into account and have not been considered from a security perspective, that should have been the first red flag, actually. This has not happened. And as you rightly point out, the economic rationale of gas trade with Russia has been always highlighted as the first priority. This needs to change now, of course. This has been forced upon Germany by Russia. In fact, there are no sanctions on Russian gas exports whatsoever from the European Union. So this has been actually a one-sided action from Russia right now, and Germany has to deal with the consequences. So when we talk about the future, Germany's energy policy and Germany's energy security approach, I think two things are important. One, maybe also coming back to the question that is in the chat regarding what will Germany's energy situation look like next winter. It will not be easy because we are now talking about all those LNG infrastructure, all those terminals that are being built out. There is, in fact, right now about 10 billion cubic meters BCM of LNG in long-term contracts that some German companies have signed with some other suppliers. But this is all not for this year. So most of this supply will start coming in 2026, 2027. The terminals will start working on and on, but the fact remains that Germany is now extremely exposed to the global LNG market, and namely to the spot market bit of it. So it is very vulnerable to any price and supply fluctuations on the market, and it will remain so until the end of the year and actually throughout to 2026, 27, meaning there is only that much we can do in terms of gas supply. I mean, if Germany is able to overprice the other buyers and get the supplies, then it's good. If not, then Germany really needs to double down on its own gas demand reduction. So that's actually the only sensible thing that can be done within this shorter time frame. Is we have seen that last year Germany has reduced its gas demand by 15%. This year it needs to first maintain this, and this has been mostly driven by individual consumers, individual companies. That has not been, put in policy or something. And most of it, or a large part of it, is people reacting and companies reacting to very high prices. This needs to be made into a structural change. So we need policies that mandate gas demand reduction. We need policies that mandate boosting efficiency, particularly in the industrial processes. There is actually a very high share of gas demand in the industry sector that can be reduced just by addressing heating in industrial buildings. It's nothing futuristic. We don't need hydrogen for that. We don't even need electrification for that. We just need to insulate the building. So there is lots that can be done within a shorter time frame. And maybe my last point on this, in terms of how Germany should go about its future energy policy and energy security, I think we need to admit the fact that energy security cannot be only about security of energy supply anymore, for the very simple fact that security of the supply is not there. Volatility on the oil and gas market is the new normal. We are very in a very tight gas market right now. We don't have any spare capacity for long-term contracts. The spot market will react to political and market trends. And we will continue our dependency on China when it comes to the clean energy technologies. This will, I very much agree with what Mr. Rühle said in the beginning, that we need to address that dependency, but we also need to admit that this will take a lot of time. Building one average critical raw materials processing capacity takes you 6 to 7 years. So when you're talking about diversifying away from China on clean tech and critical raw materials, we are looking at the end of the decade. Until then, we have to live with the dependency. So security of supply is a difficult thing, and we need some political instruments to manage that. What we need to do more is really to address the security of demand and the resilience of energy systems. We need to look at security of infrastructure, what Mr. Rühle said, cybersecurity, security of existing pipelines. We need to look at flexibility of demand, and we need to mandate efficiency measures across all sectors of the German economy.
Thank you very much. My next question goes to you, Ms. Valle. The Spaniards drastically save energy according to the recently passed law, out of solidarity with Europe. What does this law say exactly? And do you see the same approach also in other EU and NATO countries?
Well, this law sets the called Evariant Exception. Well, first of all, before the exceptions, Spain and Portugal were tied into the broader European Union electricity pricing system, which sets electricity cost based off the price of whichever energy source is the last one in feeding the grid, and the last one is the most expensive one. So, I mean, everybody gets the same price for the electricity they are producing, regardless of how the electricity is produced. The price is then set by the most expensive way of producing electricity. As a majority of Europe's power system runs off natural gas, the surge in natural gas price had a commensurate effect on electricity costs throughout the EU last year. So why this law? Spain and Portugal rely far less on Russian natural gas than most of Western European countries. And so they argue that they should be able to strip out the price of gas in their own electricity price setting system. The exception was implemented in Iberian Peninsula power markets from January 2022 in order to lower prices for end users until May 2023. The law sets a price cap applying exclusively to gas for power generation. And this cap is of around 50 euros per megawatt hour on average for a year, and is applied to gas in the wholesale electricity market. It means, producers that generate electricity with gas are forced to sell at a maximum price, regardless of the market price of gas. Thus, the final consumers benefit from this because they pay less, but electricity producers need to see their cost compensated. For this, an adjustment mechanism is established that is equivalent to the difference between the real price of gas and the maximum price imposed by the Evariant Exception. Well, the gas cap is financed through so-called congestion revenues that are the benefits of the electrical interconnection with France, and a charge imposed on buyers who benefit from the measures. Actually, the electricity bill has been lowered, and according to government sources, for an average receipt of 100 euros, there has been reduction in the energy bill of around 15 euros, more or less. So, the electricity bill has been lowered. And regarding if other countries could apply this model, actually, this model fits in Spain and Portugal largely due to the fact that both countries have a high shares of renewables and are part of a rather isolated power system with limited interconnections. So the mechanism has been effective in reducing bills for consumers because it allowed electricity price to better reflect the lower cost of renewables in a context of very high gas prices. So in power systems with high shares of coal and gas, it will have not provided the same saving for consumers. Furthermore, neither the EU-wide price cap nor the Iberian mechanism can provide a way out of the energy price crisis in the long term, since both mechanisms fail to introduce a structural change in the form of energy savings and a switch away from fossil fuels.
Thank you very much. The next question I have for you, Mr. Chiquiparga. How do you envisage European security architecture in terms of energy that fits with NATO strategy and also has an added value for Europe?
Well, first of all, the good news is that the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the escalation of the war practically developed a new pillar, an energy pillar for the transatlantic bond. So the significant energy supply in form of LNG is something that the US brought in to the picture. And it's a qualitative change because Europe, in terms of energy imports, has been and will be dependent, but it's a qualitative change on whom do we depend. And it's always much better to depend on an ally with whom we share values and interests than with someone who might become an adversary. So this is the good news. I would say that it would be very important to emphasize, and in many countries it's very much part of the discourse, but also in Hungary it might be useful to push that there is no return to the status quo ante with Russia. So to the period prior to February 24, 2022, because there might be some hopes alive that one day there could be some normalization of relations and return to normal, at least in terms of trade and energy. It's not a mainstream idea in Europe, and I don't think that it should be a mainstream idea, but it's important to formulate a coherent message in this regard. And of course, once alternatives in terms of energy or LNG or other alternative supplies have been developed, there will be a tangible option for European countries to opt for other sources. We should also be looking for alternative supply routes in the southern neighborhood. This has also been happening for years now. Maybe Turkey can have or has been playing a more determining role in this regard. As much as I'm aware of, Turkey is indeed positioning itself or trying to position itself as an energy hub on the route to Europe. It might be possible to go in this direction, but also other Middle Eastern and North African countries that have resources, or the Eastern Mediterranean, stability in that region would be crucial. And it would be important to use these opportunities and support stability and possible energy import solutions also through NATO cooperation and not only within the European Union framework. And maybe it's a long-term idea or longer-term idea, but should the war in Ukraine come to an end, it would be very important to consider how it is possible to tie in Ukraine as much to the European energy market, not only in terms of supply and not specifically not as a transit country from Russia, but providing energy to Ukraine, and also, if possible, for various reasons, then, for example, relying on fracking technology within Ukraine. It's a tricky issue, and especially because, as much as I'm aware, most of those territories that were considered for fracking were in the eastern part of the country, currently under conflict or under Russian occupation. But it might be there might be some prospect in this regard to rely on Ukrainian energy supplies as well, but it would require definitely a very sizable reconstruction first, and bringing the Ukrainian energy infrastructure in a well-functioning condition. So it can only be a longer-term idea.
Thank you very much. And my next question is for you, Ms. Pastukova, and it is about Germany and the role of Germany. The largest economy in Europe, what can Germany contribute actually to Europe's energy security? And do you see Germany having a special responsibility when it comes to building a resilient and sustainable energy supply? The floor is yours.
Before I come to that, maybe a very quick reaction to the previous speaker's comment on we now have a new vector with US coming into picture as kind of an ally on the LNG. I think we have to be in the clear that we don't actually have much power over how dependent we become on the US or not. When we heard last year President Biden saying America will deliver 50 billion cubic meters of LNG to Europe this year, this was a political promise, but actually it has close to zero leverage over the LNG supplies. We actually ended somewhere around there. I think, yes, it delivered 48 BCM over the average levels last year, but no thanks to him or to the administration. It's actually thanks to companies who have just reacted to the price signals from the European market to Europe becoming the new premium, Europe paying absolutely massive amounts of money for this LNG supply. So this is a place we have relatively little political leverage over. This is very different from cooperation with Russia, where we are working with a state company, and a lot of this is actually in the realm of political negotiation. So here we have to admit, yes, the US LNG is there for us, the Middle Eastern LNG is there for us, but this is very much a free market, and we are quite exposed to high prices over a long time. Now, Germany's role and what it can contribute to Europe's energy security, it definitely has a special responsibility just because it's the largest economy, and it is also the largest funder or the largest contributor to the European budget, obviously. So it has a certain leverage over how this money will be used for boosting the resilience of European energy infrastructure and energy systems in total. Germany is also the largest importer and consumer of gas within the European Union. So it has the responsibility, also partly because it got the whole European Union into that mess in the first place, but it has the responsibility of flattening the gas demand curve, which right now really goes up very quickly in the winter because of the heating system, because about half of German buildings, commercial and private, are being heated with gas, and is relatively flat in the summer, where gas is basically the industry's demand all across Europe. So Germany really needs to double down on flattening the gas demand curve so that Europe is not exposed to that, to those high and very volatile prices, and is not dependent on supply vulnerabilities. So last year, for example, the Freeport LNG terminal in the US blew, and this ended up in US cutting 1/5 of their export capacity. This can happen this year. We'll never know what happens on that end of the infrastructure. So the less we're dependent on this market, the better, and Germany has a real leverage there. In terms of looking ahead, I mean, it's not just about gas, right? It's about transitioning to green or renewables-based energy systems, where, as many already said rightly, we are dependent on China quite a lot, and the supply chains there are also not diversified. There, Germany, I think, has a real potential of helping Europe establishing a much more diverse and much more sustainable network of partnerships with other countries. Germany has a very, very large list of energy partnerships with different countries, both industrialized and in the global south, and leveraging these partnerships to make sure clean energy supply chains, including manufacturing renewables technology, including critical raw materials, including local value creation in those countries. So basically producing green goods in there instead of Europe in bits where European industry is just not competitive anymore. I think Germany really needs to tap into that. Last but not least, I think what Germany has experienced last year, it needs to learn its lesson, not just on the gas supply side or on the fossil fuel supply side and dependence on Russia, but also in terms of climate resilience of energy infrastructure. I know we don't talk about this much often, but last year Germany had real trouble securing its coal supplies because the Rhone, the river, has literally dried out. It was very low water levels, and the ships couldn't move anymore. This kind of weather events will happen and will continue happening. The grid infrastructure, for example, will continue being exposed to extreme weather events as well. So really looking into energy system security from the climate resilience perspective and securing this infrastructure against any weather-related extremes would be extremely important for Germany to drive throughout the whole Europe. I think that's the last point I want to make. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now I would open our panel, but I would ask if you, dear speakers, if you have some remarks and comments after discussion till now. From your colleagues, you have heard some inputs and commenters. Okay, I see that's not the case. So I would ask now Patricia to join us. Patricia, I saw that we have some questions. And maybe you can tell us what question are. with us in the chat.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Mariam, and thank you very much to all the panelists for very interesting interventions. I would like to ask the first question that we received, which was from one of our colleagues from YATA Hungary, which says, if we use a big share of Middle Eastern energy sources, for instance, from Qatar, to diversify the European market, how does that affect the NATO's strategic considerations? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Mr. Rule.
Thank you. I don't think it would change the calculus very much, because NATO is as such is not an importer of energy. It's the allies who do, and in the end they are taking care of the supply for their national military forces. So as long as the importer is seen as reliable, and this I think is the case for Qatar as well as for Algeria and others, then I think this issue is not a game changer. There was another. I don't want to preempt it, but there was another question on the NATO pipeline system, which probably is more closer to my area. So if it's okay, I would answer that one as well. There was a question from Josip Hungary, the same guy, Josip Hungary. YATA Hungary, is there a plan to expand the NATO pipeline system to Central Eastern Europe, and could it be integrated for civilian purposes? On that one, there's several points of an answer. First of all, so that everybody knows, NATO has, since the 1950s, a pipeline system that is basically running underneath Germany, France, and the Benelux countries. We called it at the time the Central European pipeline system. Today, it's a very Western European pipeline system, because it ends at the former inner German border. And and this is a pipeline system that is meant to supply our forces in a crisis with various types of fuels. It has just recently been certified, by the way, for sustainable aviation fuel. And there are two things to be said. First of all, the question of Josip, can it be used for civilian purposes? It is used for civilian purposes all the time, because we fortunately don't need it yet in a military configuration, because we, ever since the Cold War came to an end, we basically rented it out for civilian purposes. I'm sitting here at NATO headquarters about 4 kilometers away from the Brussels airport. And the Brussels airport is one of the airports that is supplied by the NATO pipeline system, as is Schiphol in Amsterdam. And yes, the other question to Josip, there's an ongoing discussion for years, actually, about extending this pipeline system to the east, because, as I said, it ends even before the current German-Polish border. So some eastern countries have said we want that pipeline system be extended. That is a big debate among allies, because it's very expensive. Of course, it would be a very long pipeline. And the second point is, if you connect big airports like Brussels or Amsterdam, you can run this thing in peacetime for even a profit. If this goes into the eastern part of Europe, where the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, is not quite as strong, it's more difficult to make a business case for it in peacetime. And I think these are discussions that are ongoing among allies for many, many years. I hope we'll soon come to a conclusion, but it shows that this pipeline system is of considerable relevance, and now, in light of Russia's aggression, I think the relevance has grown even more. So watch this space. There will be very interesting developments probably over the year or next in terms of extending this pipeline system to the east.
Thank you very much. I would ask also you, dear speakers, to comment these two questions. I see Ms. Pastukova, you want to share your thoughts with us?
Sure, yeah, just on these two questions, quickly. So on the countries, on the Middle Eastern energy sources, as it says in the question, I think it's not just the Middle East. Let's name them also. It's Qatar, it's Saudi Arabia, most of it. It is actually also Azerbaijan, which has risen as the new supplier of pipeline gas to Europe. And all of them are, of course, to a certain extent, a political risk. We have seen, some restrictions put on the, or some attempts, let's say very low-key attempts at using dependence on these supplies as a leverage. We have seen how much, for example, the European institutions are exposed to Qatari influence with the last year's scandal in the European Parliament. I don't know if you have been following that. We have seen how difficult it is for the European Union to react to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in between Azerbaijan and Armenia, given that Azerbaijan is now one of the kind of pillars of pipeline gas supply. So this is, of course, this exposes the European Union countries to a different kind of political risk. On the positive side, or not sure if it's a positive side, but on the other side, what we have to admit is that these countries are global suppliers of oil and gas, and they have an image as such. So they have a reputation to protect. They have lots of big customers, not just in Europe, but also China, India, many African countries, in fact, as well. So the exposure of energy supplies in these countries to the political interests or to interests of those in power is much lower, I would say, than what we see in Russia. What we have seen in Russia last year is basically Gazprom being sacrificed as an export company to the political purposes of Kremlin, because European gas exports by Gazprom have been more than 2/3 of what Russia has exported in total. Right, so it's they basically cut their own position as a global supplier of gas, and its future is also now not secured because of restricted access to all the new technologies for building up LNG terminals, for example. Obviously, the Middle Eastern countries or Azerbaijan would not want that to happen. So I think we can assume that this is a risk, but this is a manageable one. Much more important than worrying about that is really to make sure the strategy that Europe has introduced last year, the REPowerEU, to really wean off dependency on gas imports in total, not just on gas imports from Russia, takes off. If this does take off, then, and I'm coming to the second question, then if like all the goals within the REPowerEU strategy are achieved, then European gas demand drops by 50% by the end of this decade. So comparing this gas demand drop with the conversation about, as Mr. Rulli rightly pointed out, very expensive, quite long-term projects, if we're talking about new pipelines, I think this necessity is much less than perceived if the gas demand really drops as much as European politicians intend. If there is a plan to expand that NATO pipeline system to Central Eastern Europe, then I think I'm not very sure it will continue to like 100% of what has been planned, because there might not be that much need for these pipelines by the end of the decade.
Thank you very much. Patricia, I see that we have another questions too.
We do actually. There's a question from one of our colleagues from YATA Croatia, which asks, what steps would you recommend to improve stability and cooperation with Maghreb countries to create a healthier environment for trade and development?
Very interesting topic. Mr. Chikivarga, please.
Thank you very much. And actually, as I raised partly this issue, I feel the urge to address. Of course, it's very complex, and we could talk about the security and development nexus for days. I would only like to add two things. First, it's very important to point out what also my colleagues told, that actually these energy relations are not favors, but it's business, a very expensive business. So it always must be a very careful consideration, not only whom do we depend on, but what is the economic rationale behind. As for improving these kind of relations with Maghreb countries, I very much would argue that it must be still condition-based. First of all, saying that stability and security is kind of a precondition, and European countries or NATO countries can, to some extent, engage in improving the situation in this regard. We have in place some capability building and assistance programs. And of course, it must be tailored very carefully not to conduct those not well functioning, large scale, on the ground interventions or intervention-like presence that we have witnessed after the turn of millennium, but tailored small footprint capability building programs might help the situation, and definitely engagement, because engagement, as we have seen in the case of Mali, if the European countries, if the European Union, if European missions in any sense are withdrawn, then it might be Russia, it might be non-state actors who step in, and the situation is deteriorating. But the first recognition should be having a stable government, because otherwise there would be no investment in infrastructure and it wouldn't work at all. This is, I would say, quite simple. The other one, and that might be some perspective idea, that European Union and NATO countries, but maybe not NATO as such, because the profile of the alliance is different, but tying energy to green policy goals and climate assistance, providing assistance to these countries in mitigating the effects of climate change would make parties more interested in the Maghreb countries, governments, local communities, everyone. So there must be some kind of mutual consideration of the issue that European countries, I don't really like to use the term rich countries, but we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have some of the investment that might provide some support for the needs of people living in Maghreb countries, and it might create a political incentive to cooperate on other issues. So this kind of tit for tat, if you assist with energy, the European need, then we might be able to provide more in other fields.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rulem, Ms. Pastrukova, Ms. Vale, do you want to add some remarks? I would give you 2 minutes for this.
Well, I mean, there's not much to say other than I think this discussion already made it clear that I think what happened in February last year was a wake-up call in many respects, and the fact that Russia, as was said before, basically stopped supplying most of its European customers with gas, the fact that one could now see what until then was only a suspicion, that constructions like Nord Stream were not just about getting around Ukraine as a trouble country, but actually the other way around, would allow Russia to make trouble in Ukraine. I think these things that were assumptions by some people and disputed by others have now become certainties. And so I think we are looking at energy security in a more somber way than we did, and some of us did before that event. But it was also said by all the experts that we can't just flip a switch and say, well, let's replace Russia by other players. Or let's go to a different energy system altogether, maybe something greener and cleaner. All this is a long-term change, which will take years. Also, technology, I think, is not there where we need it to be. So I think, in retrospect, I think the February 2022 will be seen as the moment when the energy landscape in Europe began to shift, and it will be shifting for a long, long time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pastrukova, you wanted to add something, as I saw.
Yeah, sure. On the Maghreb countries, I think last year we have seen a very good example of what can practically be done in the very short term to both help promote clean energy cooperation with those countries and make the situation on the very tight global gas market a bit better. Germany, for example, together with the United States, have struck a deal with Egypt last year on the brink of the Global Climate Conference, where they facilitated the build out of 10 gigawatt of renewable electricity in exchange for which Egypt agreed to phase out 5 gigawatt of inefficient gas power plants at home. So basically they've been replaced by renewables, and topped by, and on top of that comes even more. And this gas is then being exported to Europe. So what is happening is moving inefficient gas consumption from the producing countries in Northern Africa to Europe, which is, on the one side, it really helps promote the transition in those countries. On the other side, it is a much quicker way of securing additional gas supplies than, let's say, talking about investing in new production, because developing new greenfields takes years, and it is also a very contingent topic from the climate perspective. So this is one way of kind of concretely implementing energy partnerships with the Maghreb countries. And the second thing I think that we need to start considering as the Europe is rethinking its whole economic model and thinks through its future industrial competitiveness, with many sectors really dependent right now on gas supply, is to think how these countries can be full-fledged economic partners for the European Union. When we look at the political instability in the region, when we look at the volatility of the regimes, we actually are looking at very resource-dependent countries where the elite has access to resources and the resource rent. And in order to change this, we also need to help these countries change the economic model. This can happen by via energy and economic partnerships that help to lower the investment costs, that help to build local value, including green goods, including renewable-based hydrogen production. Until this starts happening, we won't see. I think the economic shift needs to accompany the shift in the political landscape and build up of the political resilience. So that's maybe the second point I would highlight.
Thank you very much. Now I would ask you, Patricia, again, to share with us the next question.
So the next question comes from one of our colleagues from YATA Spain. He wants to know about the role that NATO will play along with the European Union in the protection of critical infrastructures. He says that an agreement was signed 6 days ago to create a task force on resilience of critical infrastructure, indeed, and how will this protection will be implemented? And if he can add a follow-up question, which role will the private sector, supply companies, energy providers, infrastructure companies, or security companies, etc., can play in this role? Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Mr. Roland.
It's exactly right. We had this task force set up recently, and we're now trying to fill it with life. I cannot tell you what the full breadth of things that they have discussed, because I wasn't there. My colleague went there, and he is now actually serving directly for the next couple of weeks for the Secretary General to set this all up. So, but the point is, as I said before, we have a real dilemma which we need to overcome. The dilemma is that the energy infrastructure operators and owners, like companies, they know, of course, their own infrastructure. They build it. They know where it is. They can see the vulnerabilities, and they see, above all, they have an idea what happens if it gets hit, if something happens. They know what the consequences will be. NATO doesn't know that. We don't have indigenous pipelines experts and stuff. So we have the military forces we could use to deter attacks on infrastructure, or to, in some cases, maybe to help after an attack. But there is a disconnect between these two players. And we therefore, and this is part of what this new structure should be doing, we need a much better dialogue between NATO, the military in particular, and the companies that run infrastructure about this whole issue. We know the threat picture quite well, and they know the consequences of the threat quite well. So we want to have an exchange on this, and my colleague who just is now helping out the Secretary General, he's been busy the last several weeks setting up meetings with companies getting the military and the companies together and so forth. Now, in theory, this sounds easy. You just sit around the table and start talking. But in reality, of course, these are highly sensitive issues. We talk about vulnerabilities, which of course any malign actor can exploit. So we need to be very careful about whom are we talking to, what kind of confidential information can we even reveal to a non-NATO source, let's say. And for the companies who are, of course, making money, they don't want to reveal their vulnerabilities either. But good news is we had the same experience some years ago, earlier, 10 years, 15 years earlier, when the question of cyber war came up. Cyber attacks happen all the time. And you need to have a good relationship. NATO needs to have, and the EU needs to have good relationships with the cyber companies, because they can tell you far more about the intricacies of cyber than anyone else would know. So we have developed very good relations with companies in the cyber world. And that's why the Secretary General also came to us. Cyber is also part of what we do, and said, can you do a similar thing in the area of infrastructure, energy, but also, let me add, also communications, because while we have thousands of kilometers of pipelines going from Norway, for example, to other places in Europe, we also have Google with thousands of kilometers of fiberglass cables. So they also can be cut. They also can be damaged. So we are looking at this as a whole big package. And of course, ideally, if the NATO, which is a transatlantic organization, and the EU look at something together, their power to make things happen, to change things, would be much, much bigger. And that's why the logic took hold of having doing this discussion with infrastructure operators and owners together with the EU.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ulle. Since we have 7 more minutes, I would ask the last question. Thank you, Patricia, for sharing with us the questions from audience. And now my last question would be our title of our discussion is for today: 3 countries, 1 aim, rethinking European energy security. So how countries you represented and Europe must rethink their energy security. I would hear your suggestions, your ideas, and your conclusion at the end of our discussion. I would ask Mr. Chiki Varga to start, please.
Well, it's a rather difficult question for the case of Hungary, because rethinking energy security would definitely require a fundamental change in foreign policy and economic policy in some aspects. The good news is that I sense some kind of discussion, at least, among the Hungarian government circles and also experts, because we have witnessed the political price of sticking to Russia for more than a year into the war, maintaining this very close relation in terms of energy policy and the dependence on Russia. And this has created, but to put it mildly, a sense of isolation among allies. Now, I think some of the conclusions have already been drawn by the Hungarian government. I cannot really say there might be some deadline for gradual and slow shift, but I would expect some change by the end of 2023, independent of what the next stage of the war would be. And one fundamental idea behind this consideration is that after the shock of the war itself and the shock regarding the security of supply for energy for European countries in general and Central European countries and Hungary in particular, now energy policy experts, security policy experts, and I think politicians are somewhat more in an even situation. at least the shock is over. And despite of the fact that energy has cost a lot, much more than we expected, and much more that was, of course, welcome. And it hit particularly hard after COVID. But actually, there is a feeling that things are somewhat under control, which is a good thing. And this should nurture the situation for more economic consideration also in Hungary. That would be really a precondition, this kind of change, if we want to go into a real in-depth shared solution of our dependencies, at least on Russia.
Thank you very much. Ms. Valle.
Sorry. Well, I think that European Union has already wide policies aiming to deliver secure, sustainable and affordable energy for member states. In this sense, the EU energy security exists and cover these three fields: the security of supply, affordability, and sustainability. And these are the three elements that form the most used definition of energy security. And as I said, EU has policies aiming these objectives, but I think that the problem has been that we didn't have a common perception, a common consideration of energy security and the threats it challenges. And in fact, each country has freedom to choose their own national energy mix. But we have just seen the differences between, for example, Spain or Germany or Hungary. So, at the same time, I believe that EU has reacted well to the crisis in Ukraine with speed and unity, which may have surprised Russia itself. And just this, the lack of unity and the slowness have traditionally, I think, been the main challenges for the EU. And well, we mustn't, we have to know that actually it's a sensitive issue, because energy may have a strategic role and is essential for the development of countries, and many member states may be reluctant to cede part of her functions on energy. In fact, NATO didn't deal energy security, I think, until 2008 at the Bucharest summit. So I think that has been the problem. There was no only consideration of energy security, but I'm optimistic. And I think that I have a positive consideration of the EU reaction to energy crisis. And I think that it may be an opportunity for Europe to enhance and accelerate the energy transition and therefore the energy security.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Pastukova.
Many thanks. Yeah, this is another topic for a whole workshop, actually, but I agree with Anna in general that we do need a common perception on that within the European Union among the member states, because we have an integrated infrastructure, we have an integrated pipeline system, we have a common power market. And if vulnerability appears in one of the member states in one part of the infrastructure, it inevitably spills over to other member states. We have seen rolling blackouts in the European power grid in the early 2000s already. This can happen again due to either weather extremes, due to military aggression, or just some technical hiccups. So this can happen anytime. We see also that there is basically a permanent state of vulnerability when it comes to infrastructure, import infrastructure. I don't want to imagine that, but let's imagine the Norwegian pipeline is disrupted for some time. This will be a huge blow to the whole European economy, not just to Germany. And there is only that much you can do unless there is some coordinated action to really monitor the waters to ensure the security of the infrastructure. But when we talk about energy security largely, this is actually, we really have to think about it as a function of supply and demand. So it requires managing both together. This is actually not a new insight. If you look back at the oil crisis, for example, of the 70s, it has caused a huge wave of new energy efficiency measures in response to the oil price crisis, curbing global oil consumption. That didn't prevent the current energy crisis, and we need to be smarter this time. Right now, we're looking at a much more complex energy system. We're looking at energy markets that are centralized, but also need to function flexibly, separated from each other if it's within the member states. We're looking at energy systems that are exposed to extreme climate events and are dependent on adequate supply chains beyond fossil fuels. It includes heat pumps, solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, skilled people. That I think that's one shortage we haven't managed yet, like shortage of skilled personnel to tackle the operations of critical energy infrastructure. This needs to be tackled as well. And what we need to accept is that 100% guarantee for energy security and affordability is just not possible, not by expanding supply, not by addressing demand. So there will be always some risk of scarcity. There will be always some risk of something not being delivered. So some management regime that can address this permanent state of scarcity, I think that's what Europe needs to work on.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Rule, please.
Since we're out of time, all I would like to say is one thing. We need to be careful as we are rebuilding the energy system post Russia, if I may say so. And I'm saying this as the head of energy and climate, we must not lose sight of the climate issue. The idea that, of course, we scramble now to get enough gas for the winter to have warm apartments and stuff. That's completely normal. But there will be always some who said, well, this is now the priority, so forget whatever we said about climate, about greenhouse gas reductions and the like. And I think it's very important that we, at least here in NATO, do not think like that, and that we keep, while we look at energy security, maybe in more depth than we used to, and especially in infrastructure security, we do not lose sight of the climate change problem, because that will ultimately be a true challenge for the military in more than one ways. And so we need to look at both, or to quote American President Joe Biden, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would say it was a pleasure for us, for YATA Germany, YATA Spain, and YATA Hungary to host this very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Chiki Varga, Mr. Rule, Ms. Pastukova, Ms. Vale. Thank you for joining us. And of course, I want to thank our participants for attendance, for questions. So thank you very much again, and see you next time. We discussed today very, very important question, and it was very productive meeting, very productive discussion, I guess. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.